started today. And I first want to introduce Mboneni. He's one of our PhD students. He's from DST, nearly said DSTV. DST, busy with his PhD, and he will introduce himself in more detail. But just to share how, again, we hope the session to go, Mboneni will share some ideas and pose some questions. And if you want to participate in the debate, please just join us in the center. And after an hour, we will say thank you. And then we will ask Mani, our guest speaker from outside, who will talk on leadership to us. And the same principle will apply. So from my side, thank you very much for being here today, everybody. I hope you had a great month behind you and that things are going well. Just maybe as an introduction, what do you think is happening in the social system currently in Mecca? Before we get into the details of Mboneni. What do you sense is happening in the social system currently?
Social system?
Yeah, in the last month. Any interesting movements?
Interesting movement is I have not been very observant of the social system. Unfortunately, I have been focusing my mind. Okay, I think there is a work-related situation in the social system. People are very concerned about the jobs, and people want to see whether the society is going to get more people employed. And actually, that is what I'm dealing with. Because I'm dealing with National Department of Public Works, where I have to take care of, I have to use the infrastructure budgets, and the infrastructure projects to create jobs for a lot of people. So that is what I'm dealing with right now. So the concern for jobs and of course the Ukandla is also one of the social things that happen recently.
Now, do you think you're looking at these things as little projects that must be concluded and be dealt with, or do you really look at it in a systemic way?
I look at it in a systemic way. Actually, I look at it from it is a developmental thing. Okay, it is a developmental thing. We have to create jobs for people. We have to build solid infrastructure. We have to give people some skills. We have to give development enterprises within the construction process with the project. So it is actually systemic. It's probably I've borrowed some dramatic license to describe it as a development engineering.
Okay.
So we have to do all these things in one, and that becomes a little bit more complex than the conventional management that we are conversant with.
Okay, so let's ask Neil. He's in the academic environment. To what extent are you helping America with this challenge?
Well, I think it's just developing solutions. So in other words, I can say from my perspective that what I do in a lot of the assignments is I move from information-based to solution-based. So I get the students to try and think for themselves, to apply the material in a way that they can conceptualize it from their own viewpoint. And that's very important, because if the adult learner is different to the child learner, then the adult learner brings a whole field of experience to the learning situation.
And Neil, do you sense, in the broader context, that the academic environment in our social system in South Africa are contributing in solving the bigger issues?
I think it's very decentralized, and I often think it depends on the teachers or the professors as how it comes out in the student. Because I think the students are the most important thing is the pass mark. So it depends how they approach learning. And if they approach learning in a constructive or a destructive way. A destructive way where they would cut the students down if they don't replicate information, and constructive is where they actually think of solutions.
Okay. All right. Okay, those are just a few. Thanks for sharing that with us. Mboneni is going to talk to us to matters related to innovation. And I often wonder if we clear in our mind what constitutes innovation. Because I think there are many definitions. You get the pragmatist definition from the West. You can get a more rational definition from the North, a more idealized idea. Then you can get probably a more humane definition from the South, which we predominantly should represent. And then you could probably get a more holistic definition from the East. And I do hope in our listening to Mboneni and what he wants to achieve in his PhD, that we will also apply our minds with the paradigms that he's going to present to us. So Mboneni, with those few words, let's go.
Thank you so much, Benny, and I want to welcome everybody, seeing that I've been welcomed here already. By way of introduction, my name is Mboneni Moape. I'm going to go backwards and then forward in terms of who I am today, but having started by where I'm coming from, because it has a huge impact on the work that I'm doing. I was born in Limpopo province, grew up in the rural areas, and part of the curious mind I had been asking why things were the way they were. When I look at the behavior, whether it was how plants and animals behave when the season turns, whether it was about, the existence of life in the moon and in the stars. And that curiosity has built up to a point where you've got a lot of questions and you cannot ask anybody because you are not supposed to ask those questions. The system tells you things are what they are when you ask, and when I got into school and I begin to learn science, and I begin to appreciate some of the things that informed me that actually what I have been looking and asking for have been coming from a young mind, but they were scientific questions. And I decided when I was 14 years old that I'm going to be a scientist, which I did become at some point. And then I deviated. I became a manager in science and innovation. But the point that I really want to make is a lot of the questions that I've asked then, instead of disappearing, they've probably just changed the focus. And when I started working for government, the one thing that I've always wanted to deal with was, why is it that we've got countries that are very successful when it comes to the development and the implementation of policies in innovation? And my definition of success has been by looking at how the quality of life that the people in a specific country live, and then relate that to the role that science and technology might have played. And in the same vein, to ask ourselves, why do we still perhaps sit with challenges that persist? Is it because maybe we don't have good policies, or is it because we don't implement them? And in the process of asking those questions, I also realized that sometimes you actually get answers that even if you try them, they don't necessarily give you solutions. They may disappoint in not delivering solutions at all, or they may deliver half solutions. And this is really where my interest on looking at innovation policies in the developed countries, and I had a specific focus on the country of Finland because I had worked a lot with them. And of course, on the developing side, I looked at South Africa, which is where I've grown up, where I have got much of experience, and to say, how is it that policy-wise, in my view, a country like Finland gets it right, and we really battle along. I had looked at, for example, the various innovations that are in the market and where they come from. And not to say that there aren't any South African solutions or products, but to say we perhaps aren't as visible as one would want us to be. That's the first point. And the second point was, there is always a much bigger challenge when you deal with policies in a developing country like South Africa, because you have in South Africa, where we're sitting here, if you are dropped here by a helicopter, you probably would not have a complete view of what this country is about. And what that tells you is that maybe even the solutions and the policies that you develop and the way you implement them, it need not be one solution which is going to fit everybody. You therefore need to think innovatively, even in terms of your policies or how you're going to implement those. Now, and this really have been carried through by the concept that we've had of what in South Africa we call an innovation chasm, where we're investing a lot in research and we seem to see very little in terms of the product and processes that go through the market. And hence, where is really this gap that really is an impediment to us perhaps commercializing some of this work? And the question around what science can actually do to bring empowerment and development. Now, of course, the one question is, can science really do anything? I've got my own answer, but I think people also have their own different answers. And my sense is that perhaps there could be a huge contribution. But other people will then argue otherwise, and perhaps I'm going to have a lot of views around that particular aspect. Now, what I see every day, for example, when I go back to where I come from, is we've got almost everything by way of whether you talk about fruits, vegetables, and a lot of people will call Limpopo the Eden of Africa or South Africa. But the one thing that I always look at, and it really amazes me, is how within the period of 3 weeks you can have everything, and after 3 weeks, in the 4th and the 5th week, you actually have nothing. But you then have other parts of the country and of the world where the very same thing that you have for 3 weeks in their source, you have them throughout the year elsewhere. And I'm looking at, for example, when you've got the mangoes and the lychees and the apples getting ripe and then getting bad after 3 weeks. And you say, but what role can science and technology play? What sorts of policies can government have, if indeed it needs to be driven by government? Because sometimes we make assumptions that things need to be driven by government. So what I'm really hoping to do is to say, having looked at and taking lessons from innovation policies in a developed country, and as I said, looking at Finland, what lessons can we learn? When I toured Finland, not as a tourist, but on business, one of the things that I picked up was that they have got what they call their regions, and they also got their local communities. And region-wise, you got some regions that are very rich, for example, in specific products, or sometimes not even products, but they are exposed to specific weather situations. Like you've got regions where when it's winter it snows very badly or very well, and you've got regions where when it is season they've got so many mushrooms growing out in the bush. And what really for me intrigued me was how much they used that as part of the work that informs their innovation. So you go to one region, they establish what you call the snow police, and the snow police would be a science park that looks at doing research around snow and materials that you need to wear if you're doing snow sports in snow. And you've got areas where they've got lots of mushrooms growing, where they begin to have a biopark that looks at various technologies of mushroom cultivations. And I'm saying, how does that inform the differences in our countries? It could be per province, it could be per local government. That actually some of them we look at as nuisance, and some of them we look at as, well, it's there, but perhaps we never think that provides an opportunity to innovate. So that has really been part of what has informed my thinking around the work that I need to do and focus on the PhD, to say, what can we do here? Can we learn anything? Can we unplug what is happening there? Come here and say, well, these are the policies that we got from Finland. We're looking for a plug, we plug in, and voila, things work in South Africa. Can we do that? If we can't, what do we do to take up the lessons to make sure that we develop and we implement policies that are going to be impactful?
Okay, now I want to interrupt. So do you hear, Future, that he's saying that policy is actually an important guideline for making sure innovation will happen? Is that what you hear? Or is it just me hearing that? Future?
I think I'm getting that as well.
Okay. So he makes the assumption, therefore, in his research, in saying policy will be the foundation on which I'm going to build my argument. And if you have policy, it may be different in a developed world as opposed to a developing world, but let's see what are the lessons. But you're making the assumption that you're basing your argument that policy is a guiding principle. Sam, do you agree with that?
Well, let me get the context first. I think I came with the middle.
You came a bit late. Yes. Suma, do you want to respond?
Clarity. So you mentioned that the challenges of the implementation, but then you mentioned also the developing stage. This is where are you? What sort of point? Is it on the implementation stage of policies or in the development stage?
Okay, you want to respond first, clarify?
It's actually both. The development and the implementation. If you develop them badly, in my view, and just also to come back to your point, I have also cautioned when I started that assuming that indeed policies can make an impact, because sometimes you can have them and they might not do that. I'm looking at development first, because my view is if you don't develop good policies, you might actually implement bad policies. Even if you implement them right, maybe they might not have an impact. But you may also develop very good policies, and I think most of us may be familiar with it. And if you don't implement them, some people will argue that it's better to implement bad policies well than not to implement good policies. So the lessons and the experience that one would like to take is both in terms of the development and the implementation.
Emeka?
I'm actually trying to pin this idea down to what it should be or how it can be done, because I don't know whether policy will be actually possible to create a policy that targets innovation. Because I think the policy will probably have to target research. Then innovation will come out of research. And invention can come out of research. You probably talk about invention, which is probably getting into something new, and innovation, which is an addition to something that exists, a manipulation of something that exists.
Interesting perspective.
Yeah, what I have witnessed is that for years there's been a focus on research and development policies, and the move has of late been a specific focus on innovation policies, because the approach, in my view, of saying that policies need to then focus on R&D and then innovation comes of there, you actually exclude some of the critical players in innovation who are not in the R&D space. And that's because, for example, when you want to begin to look at what most people refer to as grassroots innovation, you actually may interact with people who have got no clue what R&D is, but who do things and who have been doing things that they have improved over time. They may not have called it innovation, but that's what it is, and it was not based on R&D. And what I would then want to say is, perhaps what we need going forward is how there can be a marriage between R&D based innovation and innovation that happens. And my view is that perhaps if you try that marriage, it could actually be maybe a much better approach, especially when you look at the developed world. I mean, when you pick up lessons from countries like India, where they have looked at what they call the addressing the market, which is, you know, like your bottom of the pyramid, and that a lot of innovations can actually be informed outside your typical R&D academia industry environment, but it can actually enrich and be enriched by the other.
Okay, yes.
Can I be even more controversial?
Yeah.
I think if you look at policy, we've tended to adopt the philosophy that started in the late 40s, which is really this idea that research flows from basic to applied to whatever. It's a nice linear mindset which is easy for people to understand, but it doesn't represent reality. And over time, that particular model, if you like, has been steadily discredited, but unfortunately it has a life of its own. And it's very strongly supported, of course, from the academic and research community, because it's their lifeblood. So as long as you get the research community deciding what the future should look like, you end up with an R&D policy where you tack the word innovation on the end as a kind of wish and a prayer. So I think, if we're honest, South Africa does not have an innovation policy. We have an R&D policy. We don't have a science and technology policy. Innovation essentially happens in two places. It happens in society and in business. And we are not developing our policy to be encompassing of the role players in innovation. So perhaps my challenge to Mboneni is, if you look at the policy framework that we have in South Africa, where are the linkages between, for example, the IPAPs of DTI and the policies of DST, or the policies of health, education, rural development, etc. with DST? You can't drive innovation from a source and hope you're going to get an outcome. You've got to have some demand which helps you to decide on priorities. So I'm going to be nice and challenging and just ask Mboneni's opinion on that.
You want to respond?
While he was still talking, I will probably respond at some stage. But what I wanted to also get is, I wanted to get more views from others on this specific point, because I think the point that Neville makes is very interesting. The point that there's no innovation policy, and the follow-up point he makes, I didn't know that we didn't have innovation policy. But what I knew was the biggest shortcoming is the point that you followed up on, to say we actually need to begin to look at how the policies we develop have got linkages with what is happening in health, in trade and industry, and other relevant agriculture, etc., which you probably would be pleased to know that we are slowly waking up to. So I just, before responding specifically, wanted to get some thoughts from other colleagues.
But I also want to paraphrase what Neville is saying, Roy, before I come to you. I'm also hearing Neville is saying, are you busy with a PhD in management of innovation amongst others? Are you busy critically to really review the notion of policy and policy formulation? And are you looking at it in a systemic way? Are you looking at it across different entities? Because he's alluding to the fact that maybe it's a very linear, almost outdated mechanism. And I would almost wonder, is he critical enough of what constitutes policy making? Or are we just going to stick how we've done it all the time? And remember, he started by saying when he was a child, he looked at the world around him and he was intrigued and was wondering why people do things the way they do it. I almost wish you can apply your mind in that same way. Where's the child that says, policy, why?
I think perhaps just a comment.
Roy, and then I'll come to you.
Perhaps the starting point is really to understand a little more about the process of innovation, which is highly complex, highly interactive with a number of different characteristics to it. Because you cannot define a policy if you haven't got the full deck. And I'll give you a statistic. It's often measured in terms of intangibles because most of it is. And research is only about 20% of the investment in successful innovation. And unless we understand the 80%, you can't really define policy that's going to address innovation. So I think the starting point is to really form a picture of what constitutes an innovation cycle, if you like, or a value chain, or whatever the magic word might be. And then ask yourself, who affects that system? Once you've decided that, then you can move to what are the policies that drive those elements, and do they talk to each other?
And Neville, it may even be possible that if he's critical enough, he can get to a point of saying, I can't define it in full.
Absolutely.
And then develop policy by not being able to define it in totality.
Yeah.
Roy?
So I want to, there might be some counterfactual reasoning here. Who says that because there's an innovation policy in Finland, it's actually stimulated innovation?
It's actually working.
Absolutely.
So that's my first thing. And secondly, who says that we're not a highly innovative country? And why do we actually look at Finland? Because we look at Finland and we say, isn't it amazing? They were the world's leaders in forestry equipment. And then this little company called Nokia came about. And then and the whole world fell in love with this country that was able to actually throw. I mean, the most amazing thing about Finland was the government threw huge resources into Nokia. It became a role model for what governments could do to create this most amazing story. But where's Nokia now? Nokia's a loser. Because Nokia failed, in my view, to understand things. But maybe the story about Finland is more important about what the Finnish people think about themselves. So I'd like to submit to you that what comes out of he sponsors Technology Top 100 are the most amazing stories. But we don't believe it. We have the most amazing things happening in this country. But as a nation, we are losers. We actually don't think we're good at it. But the Finnish people are extremely proud of what they're all about. And maybe that's the thing. Maybe Finland would still be the most amazing country even if they didn't have an innovation policy, and I'm asking you.
Isn't that by its own nature innovation is defined of policy?
No.
I think that's it. I would like him to respond.
Sorry, just...
Isn't that by its own nature innovation is defined of policy? Because policy is supposed to govern something, isn't it?
Yeah.
And direct
That's a norm.
But now, for you to be innovative, you have to have that
Break
free
the norm.
space. exactly the point you raised. You grew up as a child and you were asking very difficult questions. But as you learn and you grow, you get conditioned, and then you stop thinking outside those. So maybe that's also another thing to look at.
Yeah, I think that point is, it doesn't, well, my view is it doesn't provide you the answer of whether it should or it shouldn't, because the point is, when you've got rules, they actually confine you.
Yeah.
And
They confined you when you were a child.
Yeah.
at some point they didn't, because at some point you ask what you want to ask, and at some point then you learn that you actually shouldn't ask.
And so you accepted it.
Exactly.
Now today you write a PhD.
Yeah.
So you've accepted the rules?
Well, I hope that I'm probably gonna be able to also, in the end, provide the pros and the cons of having rules, of having policies.
That's right.
Because, as he rightfully says, policy says sometimes this is where you must look. And the action might actually be happening just outside the box of where you want to look, or where you want to protect, or where you want to enable. And for me, that will be, I will be pleased to see that in the end, I will be able to say, I will be happy if I will be able to say, this is what the policies can enable, and this is what they can actually disable, especially in the area around innovation. And why do I think that is important is because we need to learn even going forward. I want my work to inform the thinking around how we think of and how we formulate policies, because in my space, guys, policies have to be formulated so that I can continue to have a job.
Jonathan, there's a very interesting book I've just been reading, Hatching the Twitter. I don't know if you have seen the book. It's actually a story about how Twitter by default was created. And if you read that book, actually it was a mistake. It was formed by a mistake. And these guys actually accepted that they have to go and hire the hackers to bring them into the organization. And it wasn't the people that were really complying with the norm that actually created the company. But if they had the rules that stopped them from actually being crazy and doing what they were doing, probably Twitter would have not been formed. So the question is that, do we need the policies for us as a society to become creative? The last point that I want to make is that we are conditioned to think that innovation happens in certain fields of our life. But the reality is that we need to broaden the topic. And again, I think your TIPS model actually is trying to say that you can apply this across all the fields of our lives. So the policies are often formulated in areas where the risks are very high and the costs are unbearable, and we want to restrict. But in reality, in our daily life, we have to be very innovative.
Okay, Sam, thanks for that. Do you want to respond before we go further? Because I want to move on to the next
I
piece.
just wanted to make a point, because I can't remember what I need to respond to. I just wanted to make a point around the issue of policies and rules. And I actually hate both, but unfortunately we have to live with both. And I'm saying this because in the space where I operate, I want to ask anybody who's got a bright idea and give them money to solve a problem. I want to say to somebody, we've got this problem in this country, give me an idea, I give you the money. But the rules don't allow me to do that. Because if I do that, the next thing, I'm a government official who's on the news but if you look at it, you're not going to have solutions to a lot of our problems if you play according to the rules, my view. And that's really where I say we do need policies and we do need rules, because somehow we do have bad guys and they need to be managed, unfortunately. But in the process, we stifle the very thing that we would otherwise have wanted to enable. So it's really, for me, this paradox. And ultimately, we just need to find ways of balancing it. And that's why, even as I say, in the end, what I would prefer to have is a situation where I say, you got the pros of the other and the cons, and how do you actually find the middle ground where you are not actually, as a country, a loser, but where you know that what you have achieved is probably the best of the West and not the best. That really is my view of the rules and the policy.
Can I just,
Yes.
there was a very important point that Mbuneni made, and I think maybe we missed it. In his example of Finland, he talked about the differences of different regions.
Yeah.
And I think the idea that you can develop a policy which is the same for all regions, especially in South Africa, having worked on a Finnish program in different provinces, the first realization is Gauteng is not South Africa, unfortunately, and we tend to think of Gauteng as South Africa, as the norm. When you go not too far away and you're on a different planet.
Absolutely.
So I think policies must be creating an environment that can be adapted to the circumstances of different areas. And if you dig below the surface of Finnish policies, you'll find they stress collaboration and co-creation as two fundamental philosophies. In other words, how do you join people together to solve problems? And those problems are regional. Those issues are regional. They support regions being different, and they support philosophies of how people interact. So in fact, you need some social scientists involved in your policy development, because it's all about relationships. And innovation is really a social issue, because California works because people collaborate. That's fundamental. And if we miss these sort of drivers, then we develop a rule book. So I think the policies have to be facilitating, not rule-based. And remembering, business does most of the top 100 has very few people that have been affected by policy. They do it anyway. And how do we get policy to make it easier for them to do it? That's the challenge, and it's that balance. But Mboneni highlighted that regional difference, and I think that is an absolute key.
So if I can conclude on the introductory part, I think the audience is making you aware of which you know of the complexities around the notion of policy. I think you should consider arguing the idea of policy and how it relates to innovation, probably in much detail. And stay true to yourself in saying, I actually don't like the rules, but what is the place of the rules? I think that's the one piece that I get. I like the idea of collaboration, co-creation. I think in a way it permeates through your work, but I think you can articulate it in more detail. I want to go to the next part and say, can you give us 3 things or some things that you're really struggling with in your PhD? What do you need some answers on?
Most of the stuff that I need answers on is what we have discussed now. There are times when after I've, whether I've read or I've done some work, and I get very excited that I actually know. And there are times, including today, when I actually realize that there's just so much to know that you don't know yet. And all these things, the danger, what it has done to me was I sometimes find myself having these times when I'm excited that everything is going well, I'm working well, and then realize that somebody asks you a question, because I, even in my day-to-day work, encounter people and ask them work that they stuff that is my PhD, and then I realize that this thing is just not going on. And what scope? Where do I actually decide I'm going to stop asking for the sake of the PhD, but ask for the sake of knowledge going forward, because the scope just keeps increasing. That's the one thing that I find that I battle with. The other thing, of course, is...
Can I stop you with this? Yeah. Do you think Neil is clear on his research objectives if he makes that comment?
No, you've got to be incredibly focused.
So can you tease him and ask him what's his research objectives?
So what is your research objective?
My objective, or let me just rephrase it, and if it doesn't answer your question, you actually come back to me. Where I want to go, where I want to arrive at, is a place where I can say, on the basis of what we want to achieve as a department, which is where innovation can contribute to socio-economic development. This is what we need to do policy-wise in order to effect it. That's where I want to arrive. And I know that the answer is not going to be, as I said, the answer is really going to be a probability. It's going to be thereabout. But it will probably be a helpful one in terms of how we formulate policies going forward.
But I think I want to make the point, you'll have to stay clear to your purpose and your objectives. You could go a little bit astray, but if those are not clearly defined, your PhD will become a rolling activity. And every time somebody asks you questions, you'll add another objective. So I think what I could just share is, and maybe the colleagues who've already Shirley's in the process of finalizing it. Emeka finalized it. I think Emeka, this was a discussion we often had. If you're not clear on that, Darlene, I don't know what you want to call it, it will roll, Emeka. Muneni. So I can just say, be almost, not almost, you must be very clear of your goal and your objectives. I think that's something that I want to put into the pot and say, then you won't get bowled over by more questions, etc. I want to ask something else. Can you talk to us a bit about the methodological frames that you use to steer your research? I'm looking at a number of options. Firstly, a review of various policy documents from, as I said, looking at developing, but I had focused quite a bit on Finland. So that is the one part. The other is the interviewing of specific interlocutors in government, both national and provincial. Not much at local level. And interviewing for what purpose?
The first, on government level, I've looked at the process around policy formulation and implementation. And that had included the approach used in measuring the successes or the failures of various policies, which in the middle brings in the issue of monitoring and evaluation. So that is really at national government level, looking at the issue of formulation of policies. At provincial, I'm looking at implementation, because a lot of the programs are being implemented at that level. When they are being implemented, how effective have they been? What have they achieved which they were intended to? And sometimes you find that some projects achieve things that were not intended, but that are actually useful. How often do we get unintended but useful outcomes from such projects? And what lessons do we learn from that in terms of project implementation? So that has really been mainly because I was following up on the programs as they were being implemented on the basis of the lessons that have been learned in the developed countries.
Because you're doing interviews and you're doing a literature review.
Yeah.
Can I get some perspectives? Shelley, can you add, do you think that will bring in answering that question? Any ideas?
If it's to do with a lot of policy, I don't think that will be enough.
Any ideas that you want to share? What comes to mind?
My own world of work is very much a policy world. Impact study type of thing as well might help looking at the time and place and the impact of those policies, and also looking at it in a way of possibly case studies. Some cases where policies have been implemented, I just think my world of education. Have they worked? Didn't they work? Why? Those sorts of things, case studies could help.
Darlene, you work in a very policy environment, banking. What do you think? What else?
So I was also going to latch on to the case study one, that perhaps with what he's doing, that it would be perhaps something that they can look at, that what case studies have been done, where it has been proved and where it has worked, and maybe that could actually contribute.
But I want to tease you. You all talking inside the box, Roy. Isn't that interesting? So we talk innovation, and then we talk inside the box. So what will happen if Mbeneni talks to people who's got nothing to do with policy, and who's got nothing to do with this work environment? I mean, why don't you bring those energies? Mbeneni? What will happen if he talks to 18-year-olds who are dreaming about a future that's not real? And
Get very different insights, certainly.
So why won't he not consider that? You said you were curious, Mbeneni.
Yeah.
Come back to
I think what one of the challenges with what I do is there is what I do, and I tell myself I'm doing this for my studies, and there is what I do which I say I'm doing this because then I want to know specific things, and I have related to this. I have looked at a number of case studies, but I haven't defined them as being doing it for this. I have interviewed and spoken to people who are not in the defined exactly, just to have a sense of, for example, what they think of various things that are relevant. And I never brought them into the study, even though I have
informed by them.
I have somehow spoken to them, and they have informed me of certain things, and they do bring, as they say, very interesting perspectives. And I think my thinking around policies before all these engagements, especially the point I made around having the money and giving it to creative minds. A creative mind that may not bring to me a 3 years audited statement, but who can deliver. I pick those kind of ideas from the ordinary guy I speak to, and I say, but only if I was enabled to support this kind of stuff, this guy's innovative. So so that stuff is there, but I was not sure whether I should bring it in.
I think you must definitely consider that.
Could I ask one
Yes,
question?
no.
I think a group that would be very important and could be very informative would be to look at entrepreneurs and emerging companies, because one, they're probably struggling with a lot of the barriers and the issues. There are a number of incubators and accelerators and all sorts of structures around in Gauteng where one could get access to case studies and get live feedback on, you know, how influenced are they by policy, or what are the barriers to success, which might identify limitations on policy. And I think that's a group which has never really been consulted, and they could give some extremely valuable inputs, because that is the core to the future innovation society, if you like, are the people who are doing it.
So I'm almost hearing that we suggesting you must almost deconstruct your idea of whom you will talk to and really break the mold and go out of it. But what the point I want to drive is for all you PhD candidates is how important it is that you should define a pathway, a frame, a methodology, if you want to speak mode one. But you should have a clear picture of where you're going and journeying to. Because otherwise it can get messy. I love the fact that he says you almost spoke to people. I like that comment. You almost spoke to people. Well, you either spoke to them or you didn't.
I suppose that's what will bring the language being the third language.
Right, I just wanted to say something, because obviously being a supervisor, I think that, which he, in fairness, I don't think he's been given an opportunity, but the most interesting thing from my point of view is this absolute obsession that South Africans have got, that anything that comes from overseas is just fantastic. So these guys, him included, were given all this money from Finland, and they went out and they said, wow, we're going to do this. And the most important outcome of this is, what really is the bang for the buck? Should this Finnish government not have given these guys all this money and said, we walk away? You go and do exactly what Mbeneni did. Find that 18-year-old kid in a remote area of Limpopo who's done the most amazing thing and saying, we've got a couple of million euros and we're going to do something different. But so I think that's going to be the most important thing, because what do? We measure our success from a policy point of view to show you that we've got these bilateral agreements. And all these bilateral agreements bring bucks into South Africa. But with all due respect, apart from the one that we'll boast about, the German one was probably the most successful in South Africa, because there's been tangible benefits in here. And I think that that's one of the overriding questions that I'd like to see coming out of this PhD, is that you turn around and say, wow, talk about a case study. I mean, have a look at the world rankings. Finland is still the tops. Why is it that when it came down to Limpopo, you see minuscule impact? What is it? And I think that that's a major contribution from a policy point of
view. Good. Any other comments? Yes, Zulfan?
Hi. I just wanted to comment on innovation, and I know that there's a lot of variables, especially from the perspective coming from government, the budget size, you know, the group of who's being innovative, etc. I just wanted to find out, have you considered looking at what our brethren countries in Africa are doing? Because if you look at the average incubation success rate, it should be about 10%. And I've experienced that in Nelson Mandela Bay. But if I look at what the guys in Zimbabwe are doing, there's about a 43% success rate.
Yeah.
And I've also seen a 2 or 3% success rate in South Africa. I mean, this is a group of 300 with less than one, you know, about one guy coming out successful. So maybe just something to consider in innovation as well is what are these groups doing differently to get these very high success rates? Is there higher proximity? Is there a difference in mentoring? Because this is almost a process where you are essentially taking human potential capital and nurturing it into an explosive innovation per se.
Okay, that's very good.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a very useful comment, and I think it comes into the comment that Neville made, that when you look at South Africa, you need to perhaps think of the differences. And the point you make for me would be, if one follows up and look at that, is how closely linked can that be perhaps to some of the poorer provinces in the country, and how relevant can their recipe be, if there's something like that. But it's really a very interesting point.
Any last comments? I want to wrap up. Emeka?
Yeah.
Julie?
I'm trying to see how you can, your study groups for case studies. Okay.
What?
Your study groups, you're going to base your case study on a particular study group. Assuming that you want to talk about the policy makers, you're going to speak to the policy makers. I'm going to case study the policy they have made before and what advises the policy that they make and how that is going to support innovation. Then there is another set of people you're probably going to talk about is the people who are going to be recipients of this policy, assuming that the policy is in place. It is possible that you would have, maybe what has been driving your thinking is that you probably had come across situations where somebody was innovative or he was able to do some ingenious thing, probably because that person is not very close to you people, that he just is lying in West. Maybe say a very rural boy in, say, Limpopo had been quite ingenious in being innovative, he has done something. Just like, for example, one set of 17-year-old boys were able to launch something in space, and the thing crash landed somewhere in Nigeria, and they went and arrested them. They thought it was Boko Haram and started bombing. So when they went there, they saw it was just two frustrated young boys. They were 17 and 16-year-old boys. So they experimented on rocketing. And they were able to launch a rocket, something they manufactured from somewhere, and launch it into 5 kilometers into space. I mean, in the air. And the thing crash landed. So in actual fact, a contingency of military, in fact it was a military cantonment that went there, and police, they went there to find out what was going on. And they saw very shy boys somewhere wondering what was going on. So they arrested them and they found out that these guys were genius, So this is the kind of thing I'm thinking. Perhaps if you are talking about innovation or a policy that drives innovation, okay, it's possible that you probably would have seen a situation in Limpopo where there were ingenious kids, who had no support, from, say, you people who are I think you are the Minister of Science and Technology. So they have no possibility of coming close to you whatsoever, and they don't know how to apply for funds to do anything. So this policy you're talking about, if it is formulated, how is it going to benefit these people, these boys or these kids or these girls who are ingenious but do not have an ability? So I think that is very what you're thinking about. So this would be your study group. From I don't know whether I should call it an epistemological perspective. You have to go to those people. That's one. Maybe another set of groups you might think of the people he has just spoken about, like small and medium enterprises who are creative or innovative but they don't have ability to attract funds to develop what they are doing into a commercial venture. So there may be a higher step to the beneficiaries of this innovation. So in the formation of this policy, there must be a thinking of those who are going to be beneficiaries of that policy. So they are going to be the different levels of your case study somehow.
Thanks, Emeka. I think that's valuable. If you can open your space to other stakeholder groupings. I'm thinking of the young entrepreneurs, there are forums in the country. So they're both formal and informal spaces where people are clustered already with innovative activities. How do you engage them? Because in a sense they're outside the system. Last comment, Shirley?
Just one or two things, and I'm going to probably bring it back to quite a narrow focus, but other areas to possibly look at. Might be an unpopular statement, but every seater had to have a project related to entrepreneurship and innovation. And a certain amount of funding had to be set aside to drive those projects, successful or not.
So the policy exists, give money for innovation.
The policy was there, but what worked and what didn't. You could have a look, you could talk to a few, just to gain a broader perspective. The other area is indigenous knowledge. There's significant developments and there's so much happening that we forget informal policy or forgetting our world of work, and the indigenous knowledge and the indigenous way of doing it is a huge thing. I was listening to the John Robbie show, I don't know, some of you might have heard it, with the floods and the youngster that then took a whole lot of rubbish and all kinds of things and built this bridge. so that the people in the community could actually get across the water. And then he said, okay, I'm going to charge, I think, R2 per person. And the debate started raging whether this was a rip-off or whether they should actually fund. And I thought, fund this guy. You know, I didn't see him as a rip-off. So there are those sorts of stories that can be looked at. But definitely, I think the last thing I want to say is if you see policy as an enabler, and you start looking then at policy through an innovative eye, because your policy must not just follow the old format, the old box format, etc. But if it's enabling the very people who must benefit. And Trevor Manuel's in his exit speech said, we live to see the benefit to the people. And I think that's the issue in innovative policy, which is, we think of innovation as something outside of policy. Policy itself can be innovative and enabling and creating for people to do things. And to have a look at one or two of those enabling environments, and I'll pump my own story, RPL, an enabling environment for recognition of prior learning to happen, which is hugely innovative through the NQF legislation.
Okay, Nanny, you want to comment on anything before we close?
Well, I thought that you had your hand up or something.
No, he's going to just
okay.
references to it.
Thanks for the comments that have been made. The last, I've already commented on the other ones. Emeka, you're very right in that you've got the guy there who is very innovative, who you probably might not even get to see, but who is doing something very extraordinary. And my take is that this experience, even if I don't get to speak to them, maybe because I can't see them or I can't find them, the journey that I'm traveling should enable to inform the process of policy formulation to cover those kind of people. Now, the one thing that, in addition to the challenge that you've mentioned of people that might be innovating somewhere, not known, but they've got brilliant ideas, is some who are even in the space, they innovate, but the space in which they are operating doesn't allow them to. There was one of the project, for example, that was supported in the Finnish-South African partnership, where a particular application was developed for a municipality, and a very useful tool, but it just never got used because the head of IT in the municipality said it was not his project. But the application was just what the municipality needed. So you also have those sort of things. Coming back to where innovation happens, at the workplace, innovation doesn't always happen, or in most cases it doesn't happen at the boss's office. And what happens when innovation happens under the boss's office? And those sort of things cannot be, you cannot have a government policy around. You also need to look at company policies around how to accommodate innovation. So there are really a lot of challenges in that area, where you find that sometimes there are many issues that impede innovation. But I really appreciate the views that have come through, and I am going to be looking at broadening my spectrum in terms of interviews and case studies, etc.
Thank you very much, and those of you who want to join him on his journey of his research, please feel free to do so afterwards and talk to him. I think you will appreciate that. But thanks for your time. Good luck. Please stay with us. Mani, if you can join us.